Okay, this week we are going to look at what I've just titled Slave Wars to Sulla. And if you'd notice, we've been talking a little bit about the beginnings of the downfall of the Republic. This really gets a start during the late second century, second century BC, and we will talk about some of that. But the first thing I want to talk about is the slave revolt. So you've got a series of slave wars, slave revolts happening in the Roman Republic that start in the middle of the second century BC and move into the second century BC. Now, no big surprise. You already know that there are quite a few slaves in the Roman Empire, Roman Republic, and the Romans seem to be constantly worried about uprisings. And again, this is no big deal, no big surprise. We've read about how many slaves there actually were in the Republic and how much work they were doing. So they were always worried about this. Now I've listed three major slave revolts here. The last one in particular is probably the most famous, and this comes a little bit later than the time period we were talking about today, but I just wanted to mention it a little with Spartacus because he's sort of the famous slave who broke away from Roman power, and there's a great show that was made about him. All of these revolts were put down not easily. The one in particular against Spartacus took a number of years to finally put down. And then as you can see here, it ended in a pretty brutal way with people crucified. The Appian Way is the main road that leads into Rome, and it was a pretty brutal time as well. Sort of right in the middle of the second slave war, you get something called the social war, and this was really an interesting time in the Republic, whereby you've got all of these different communities that we've been reading about all throughout Italy that are not really full citizens. So they are allies and other things where they want to become full members of Roman society. And what you end up having is a series of things that bring this about. So we talked about Gaius Gracchus a few weeks ago in a lecture. He ended up talking about giving citizenship to everyone, and it didn't go anywhere. Then you've got in 91 a man named Drusus who proposed a number of laws, some on agriculture and so on, and one was giving citizenship to everybody. This was rejected by the Senate, mostly because their idea is that they are a small group of wealthy men. If they include the entire Italian peninsula in the Senate, then their power will be greatly reduced because other people would need to join the Senate, and it's not them. This did not go over in the Senate very well, and as I put here, he was probably murdered on his way home. It's not quite clear. Some of the texts tell us he was stabbed in the leg on the way home and then died. So whether he died a natural death on the way home from the Senate or was killed, we're not quite sure. But this led to a revolt of a number of societies throughout the Roman Peninsula, and this is really what started the social war. This didn't last for very long. It's about 3 years long, 91 BC to 88 BC. You do get in 90 BC a law called the Lex Julia, so the law of Julian, and this gave Roman citizenship to anybody as long as they didn't pick up arms or started a war with Rome during this time. And as I mentioned before, one thing the Senate was worried about was that all of these new people would come into Rome and really take away the power. And this is eventually what happens. All of the wealthy people who lived outside of the actual city of Rome would come in and take over. You also have a series of civil wars that start in the late second century BC and certainly in the early part and middle part of the first century BC. And part of what's going on here is that the military becomes attached to usually one person, and sometimes it's one consul, sometimes it's two consuls, and if it's two, then they split apart and then fight against each other. And this is really what's going on. And part of the background to this is that after the Second Punic War, about 200 BC or so, you really get the military being created as a profession. So as I put here, the soldiers would get paid. You would be able to pillage and keep what you found. Usually, I mean, most of it goes to the general, but then you'd be able to keep some. You'd get a block of land, and this could be your job. And as I put here, you're really bound to your loyalty is bound to the general and not necessarily the person or persons who are in charge of Rome. And this creates a problem. The first person that we see that causes some issues is a man named Marius. And I put here, he is called a homo novus, or a new man, meaning he rose up in the military, became popular, lots of people became loyal to him, and he had his family had no background or no ties to the Senate, but he actually becomes a consul. He was considered to be a man of the people, by the people, and of course, this is what caused some issues for him, especially since he was opposed by many of the wealthy people who had been there and who had planned on making the consul part of their professional repertoire. As you can see here, he was consul 6 times, which was quite a few. He was also, I mean, I'll talk about Marius in just a bit, but he was also given a triumph in 104, and that's not all that unusual. We talked about what these triumphs are. There's sort of these celebrations for a general who had things happening, and he came into Rome and had this. Now, one thing he did do, which was against tradition, was that he wore his triumphal robes into the Senate, which of course gave senators a little bit of worry because they thought he was gaining too much. Okay, so what you have is, after Marius had a whole string of those consuls, you have him retiring to the east, and he was known for his fighting in that particular area and knowing the terrain. Now you also have something happening at the same time where you've got a king named Mithridates VI. He ruled the kingdom of Pontus, and he didn't like the control that the Romans had. And so what he ended up doing is declaring war on this particular province. Now, there was a big discussion in the Senate about who to send to fight against Mithridates VI. So you've got Marius, who is really there already and knows the terrain. He has soldiers who are loyal to him. But however, you have a man named Sulla, and a very important, wealthy person. He wanted to prove his military might, and he had done this before, but he figured that since he was consul, he should go and fight. But what you have are the supporters of Marius who want him to fight as well. And what you end up getting is that Marius was chosen, which of course Sulla was not very happy with this. So Marius was chosen. He sent military tribunes to take over the military, and Sulla, being really upset, ended up gathering his own soldiers and marching on Rome to take control of it. And this is exactly what he did. He brought the army into the city, and if you remember, we talked about this a number of weeks ago about the sacred boundary surrounding the city, where you couldn't bring military or arms into it, and this was broken by Sulla. And what he ended up doing is convincing the Senate, mostly by his military, to have Marius banished. Marius ended up escaping to Africa. I've got, and I just talked about this, first time that Sulla had marched into Rome. This is the first time that it happened. Sulla then went on to fight into Asia, and what he ended up doing is making a number of the people in Rome promise that they would keep Sulla in power when he left. And of course, most of them said yes, but as soon as he was out of the way and not fighting, Marius ended up returning, and he marched on Rome to take control of it. And when he did, Sulla was declared a public enemy. And then in 86 BC, Marius is still in control. He ends up being a consul for the 7th time. And as you can see here, he wasn't a consul for very long, 17 days. By 82, so just 4 years later, you've got really a civil war. So Sulla marches into Rome, takes control again, and does this massive purge of killing all of these people, 50 to 70,000 dead. And then what Sulla ends up doing is doing something called prescription. So he creates these lists of people who were Marius and his Marius's supporters, and then They can kill them freely, and then the wealth goes to the state, really meaning it goes to Sulla. Now, Sulla was then declared dictator, and we've talked about this office before. The office of a dictator was not necessarily a bad one. It was one designed by the Romans whereby you have one person ruling or running things instead of two consuls. And the decision making is supposed to be easier with one person rather than two. And what he ends up doing is being a dictator from 82 to 79 BC, and he does a lot of things that made a lot of people unhappy. So he declared that everything he had done in the past was legal. He has the power of life and death over everybody in the Republic, and then he himself would be able to dictate where areas that the Romans were still conquering would go. So this gave him a lot of power. And if you remember, Sulla was working with the Senate. He got the Senate strengthened, and then, which is real. And the second thing I have on here about what he ended up doing is I've just said, bills put forth by the tribunes needed prior agreement. Now, this is something new. So if you remember, the tribunes were there to protect the people. And the tribune itself, the office of tribune, had quite a bit of power where they could overturn everything. Now, anything that the tribunes wanted to do had to go through Sulla. So no big surprise, this reduced the power of the tribune. And what Sulla also did was increase the size of the Senate by double, putting in a lot of people who supported him. He was given a triumphus rel and then abdicated, meaning he just gave up his power, and then he dies in